The Knights of Rhodes in EU4 is probably one of the most difficult nations to conquer, given the fact they were on an island, forcing their enemies to do an amphibious landing, but also they fortified the island significantly, making their defence of the island incredibly strong, which is represented as a fort in EU4. Given the fact that in EU4, the island isn't particularly worth taking due to the relatively low development, it's no wonder the Ottoman players tend to leave Rhodes as one of the Christian strongholds to conquer close to its border. The really surprising thing is though, that in reality the Knights of Rhodes are actually far harder to conquer than shown in the game, and defied the odds by beating much larger armies from great empires, due to their excellent defensiveness of sieges. So in this video, we're going to explore how the Knights were able to fend off much bigger armies, like they do in the game to a certain extent. But before we get into it, why not consider subscribing for more EU4 history content like this? We begin our story by first understanding where the monastic order came from, and what were their motives of being an organisation. So, the origin of the Knights goes back to the 11th century, where they are created as a religious order for the purpose of aiding and tending to wounded crusaders. After the Kingdom of Jerusalem collapsed in 1291, the Knights sought refuge in Cyprus, and were caught up in Cypriot politics. Eventually, the Knights were transferred to the island of Rhodes in 1310, and they began to occupy it. The Knights were governed by the Grand Master, which is their leadership position, and the Council to aid him. The Knights were able to maintain diplomatic relations with other nations, and were known for the grand buildings they created. The Knights built over 30 castles and a 4-kilometre wall. The Knights also built hospitals in Rhodes, and the impact of the order is still shown today, with many of their buildings still around. The Knights of St. John were divided into 8 groups, depending on which part of Europe they came from, and they'd have meetings in the inns. During the 14th century, the Knights entered the complex political world of the Aegean Sea, with both the Ottomans and the Byzantines vying for power. Unlike other orders, the existence of the order became more relevant over time, due to the increasing power of the Ottomans. The Knights took part in the Crusade of Nicopolis against the Ottomans in 1396, but this was a bitter defeat for the Christians. For the order, this event meant the dream of reclaiming the Holy Land was permanently lost. The first true test for the Knights was when the Mamluks decided to try and take the island. So they attacked the Knights in 1440, losing, and then they had another go in 1444. During the siege of Rhodes in 1444, the Mamluks sailed 85 ships towards the island, and landed at the northwestern edge of the island. The Mamluks initially faced no resistance, and began to raid the island, but then the Knights fought back bravely, and attacked their outposts across the island. Eventually, the Mamluks halted their progress on Rhodes, and withdrew their army, sailing elsewhere. The Knights were therefore able to push back great armies. But the victory would be short-lived, since Constantinople fell in 1453, leaving the Knights to be one of the only Christian powers within the region. The next true test for the Knights would come in 1480, when the Ottomans set their sights on taking the island. And finally, on May 23rd, 1480, an Ottoman fleet of 160 ships appeared before Rhodes. The Knights were clearly outnumbered, and sources suggest they were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. So how did they manage to prevent the Ottomans from taking the island? The Ottomans' first move was to take the point of St. Nicholas, which was a defensive position for the Knights. However, the Ottomans were repelled, despite the heavy bombardment and infantry attacks. The Grand Master of the Knights, Pierre, was an expert in fortifications, and was known to be incredibly inspiring. Eventually the Ottomans retreated, after the Knights put up a heroic defence against the Ottomans, and counter-attacked them at the Tower of Italy. It was reported the Grand Master was wounded in 5 places, with a punctured lung and an arrow to the leg. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed was furious, and intended on leading a charge himself, but then a year later he died. The Knights would then rebuild Rhodes over the next several decades, in order to repel a second Ottoman attack at some stage. In EU4, I certainly think the game doesn't accurately represent just how strong the Knights were defensively, and they would easily lose the war in 1480 if it was fought in EU4. The Ottoman Sultan in 1522, Suleiman, was determined to finally get rid of the Knights that had caused his empire so many problems, and so Suleiman invaded the island with over 400 ships, again massively outnumbering the knights. Suleiman relentlessly attacked the knights and eventually made a breach in the city wall, and attacked it with all his might. The knights, however, were able to repel it. The Ottomans continued to attack the knights, with both sides being exhausted, with the knights expecting no relief force, and the Ottoman troops becoming increasingly low in morale. A truce between the two sides was eventually signed, leading to the knights gaining free passage out of Rhodes. The Ottoman victory gained them far better access to the eastern Mediterranean Sea, and the knights eventually moved to Malta. But in EU4, are you able to reverse this and get the knights to take Constantinople from the Ottomans instead, and maybe even potentially reclaim the Holy Land? Thank you guys for watching, and check out some of my other history videos.